is, say, I've got some questions, can we correspond? We will be happy to correspond with you. We would also like to offer you the option that if you have some things that you would like to study out more deeply, if you hear something you think, I need to understand that more deeply, I didn't get it from this meeting, I didn't get it when I asked questions online, and I would really like the opportunity to sit down face to face with you and study these things out. We're happy to do that. We'll meet you in a place of your choosing and sit down, open the Bible, and study these things out with you. So please make sure you reach out to us. Second, we'd like to say that there's a men's conference coming up at the end of October, and we just want to make sure all the men are aware of it. Any male 12 years and older is welcome to come. It'll be Friday and Saturday, the 24th and 25th. Did I get that right? Yes, 24th and 25th of October. And we're, it'll be like overnight camping, plenty of places for tents and cots. And there'll be food, fellowship, fun, a lot of learning experience, and a lot of planning goes into this. So please come. We'd love to see you there, and we're inviting you to come. You can bring guests. Just let us know. We tried to order T-shirts in advance. If you didn't get your size in, we'll probably try to get a couple extras to go along in that order. But we want everybody to be able to feel like they're part of that entire operation. So please plan ahead for it. If you need to schedule that Friday off, that's great. If you can't, we understand, come later that day. That's just fine with us. Are there any other announcements of which I'm unaware? Then I would ask you please to stand and give your undivided attention to Lupe for the reading of the Word of God.
I don't see the water bottle. No wonder. Thank you. Okay. First of all, good morning. It's good to be here. This is the day the Lord hath made, and I have the honor and privilege to read His Word. I'm going to be reading from Hebrews, reading all of chapter 4. I can read better with my glasses. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into His rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we, which have believed, do enter into rest. As he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again, he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if ye will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Praise be the Lord's precious word.
So today we're going to wrap up our discussion on faith. We could talk quite a bit more about it, really. It's one of the central tenets of Christianity. It's how we interact with God. It's how we have fellowship with Him. It's through faith. It's how we live today according to truths that are coming later. Right? We live today as if those truths are real now, even though they don't seem to be that way. So if you look at things through the naturalist or the empiricist type of a mindset, where only what is real is what you can touch, what you can knock on, well then the things that Christians believe aren't real, because you can't touch them, you can't knock on them, right? There are things that are coming later. And Hebrews deals with this extensively. It deals with the conundrum of how is it that we live in this world according to values of a whole different world. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because these are not values that are necessarily complementary or that they mesh together. So that's why you as a Christian, when you're living as a Christian, feel so out of place. You feel totally out of place because you're living according to a set of values that does not mesh with the values of this world. So it puts you at odds. Well, how do you live that way? That's very hard. If you've ever been the odd man out in any situation, and we all have, then you know how difficult it is to be an outcast, to not fit in. You know what that's like. And a lot of Christians waste a lot of energy trying to fit in this world. They think maybe if they dress like them, or if they talk like them, or if they, party like them, whatever it is, if I could just be more like them, I would fit in. Children, young people, you guys have it especially difficult. Those of us that are older, we've learned just through life experience that there's a lot of places we're never going to fit in, and we've learned to deal with that. You young people, preteens and teenagers especially, well, that's a difficult thing for you. I get that. That's super hard. Because you're never going to fit in. You can dress like them, talk like them, party like them. You can do everything that your friends who don't know Jesus do, and you still won't fit in. And so how do you live in a world where you don't fit in? That's one of the big themes of the book of Hebrews. And that's why Hebrews 11 has this long list of people that it says were people of faith. And you know what that list was about? You read Hebrews 11, it talks about what they call the heroes of faith. Some people, preachers, more creative preachers, have called it the hall of faith. If you know what all of them had in common? None of them fit in the world they were in. They didn't fit in. And the question that Hebrews is answering is, so how did they live? And the answer is simple. They live by faith. And every single one of the examples in Hebrews 11 that's given, that's the point. They lived by faith. What does that mean? It means they lived life today by a set of values that aren't real today. You can't touch them. You can't see them. They're not in force, but they live that way now. They did it because they were so firmly convinced that those values would one day be real, be present, I should say. Those values one day would be present. And that they would be so overwhelming, those values would be so overwhelming that it was worth living according to them now. And that was their conviction. And it was that conviction, that commitment to that Hebrews is calling faith. And we talked about how they were incorporating a view, we talked about several weeks ago, how that when they talked about faith, they were incorporating that historical view, the way faith was used. Faith wasn't that you were convinced in your mind of something. It isn't that you had some religious persuasion. That wasn't what faith was in the world in that time. Faith was a common word, and what it really talked about was a commitment you had to somebody. Not something, not to an organization, not to a group, but you had a commitment to a person. In a lot of ways, it's like a marriage commitment. Very similar to that. In fact, faith and love are used often in the scriptures interchangeably. Faith and love, because they are so similar. So if you're thinking of faith, a lot of times we think of faith and it's such an academic. We talked about this last message, but it becomes such an academic thing. It's like apologetics or proofs or evidences and then you come to conclusions, and there's an element of that. It's true. But it's so much more than that. Faith is a much more like love than it is like argument. And that's why, like I say, it's used interchangeably in many parts of the Bible. So let's get to our text for a minute with that in mind and just think about for a second what Hebrews 4 is talking about, because it's kind of awkward the way it's phrased. And it's not because we read it from the King James translation. The Greek is awkward. If you have a translation that makes it less awkward, it's because they're introducing a lot of interpretation, a lot of commentary to try to smooth it out, because the text is just awkward. It doesn't matter how you read it, what translation you read it in. The closer you get to the original, the more awkward it actually gets. And so let's just talk briefly about what's going on in the text of Hebrews 4. So what's going on here is that Hebrews says that God is still holding out an offer. He's making you an offer. At least he's making an offer to the original recipients of this letter. He's making them an offer, and the original recipients are the people of Israel. So he's making the Jews an offer. And the offer is an offer of rest. He's going to give you rest. Now, if you don't read the Old Testament much, then that doesn't, like, I don't know, it's hard to find value like that. Why would that be so important? But you have to understand that when you read the Old Testament, you'll understand that for the Jewish people, that rest, that was Shangri-La. That was that's utopia. That's the ideal state they're looking for. That is what their entire national anguish is about. To this day, you know what Israel wants? I don't want to get into a political discussion, but just deep down, let's not talk about Israel as the political state, but you know what Israelis want today? They want peace. That's what they want. Now, again, I'm not getting into the political issue and the jockeying between politicians and what the Israeli government may want. I don't know about that. But I know that if you go and you polled the average Israeli, and if you polled the average Palestinian, they'll all tell you the same thing. They just want to live in peace. That's what you want too. There's very few of us that are saying, well, we need to elect a president that is going to send our boys off to war. That's what we lack. We don't have enough wars in our life. It's not what we want in our marriages. It's not what we want in our schools. What is it we want? Well, we want the same thing the Jews have always wanted also. Rest. Rest. And they had a promise of rest, and that's what Hebrews is saying. He says, God made them a promise. He was going to give them the rest, the national rest, the individual rest, every part of it. There's that, just being able to just to be at peace. Peace with God, peace with their family, peace with their neighbors, peace with the neighboring countries. I'm just going to give you, not victory, peace, rest. And yet he says, even though they entered into the promised land, they never entered into the rest. It's one of those typical scenarios where somebody gets everything they ever wanted and yet nothing that they were looking for. They got the promised land, they kicked out everyone out, they got their homeland back. It's the same thing we're seeing right now in Israel today. They got their land back, they're living there, and there has not been a day of peace. How many times have you and I not gotten exactly what we thought we wanted and ended up with nothing we truly desired? I have counseled so many marriages where, when they were dating, all they could think of is, if I could just marry this woman, if I could just marry this man, that would be everything. I'd have everything I've ever wanted. And they get married and they find out they got nothing they wanted. They're miserable. Luckily, that's not everyone's, right? That's not everyone's experience, but it's a lot of people's experience. And this is what happened to Israel. They entered into the promised land and they thought, well, finally, we're going to have our own country. We're going to have our own government. We're not going to be slaves anymore. We're not going to be beholden to anybody. We're going to be able to do things the way I want to do them. It's like when young men move out of the house and think, well, finally, I'm going to be able to do anything I want to do. I'll be in charge of my own life. What's real funny is when they move out of the house to get that and they go into the military. That's if you ever want a definition of an irony, right? That's irony. It's not that there's anything wrong with trying to get that. The problem is we find that hardly ever we get it. And that's what Israel's experience was. And that's what Hebrews 4 is talking about. It says they wanted to get that, and they couldn't get it, they couldn't find it. And the question is, a couple questions. One is, why not? And then how could they obtain it? Those are the big questions that Hebrews is asking in chapter 4. Now the reason why, and this goes to what we're talking about today, well, the reason why is because they didn't have faith. Now, this introduces a element that can be quite deep, and I'm going to try to simplify it and boil it down to a very short little explanation that you can then build on later, maybe if you're interested in looking into it. But there is a very common misconception, especially in Christian churches, and that is that the Old Testament and the Jewish religion, Judaism, was a works-based religion. And that in the Old Testament, what mattered was keeping the law, and that through keeping the law, that's how you got saved. And what happened was that we realized we cannot be saved through keeping the law. It was a total failure. And so then God sent Jesus, and now we have grace, and we're not of the law. So they were of the law, and they're of works, and now we're of grace, and we're not of works. And there's this massive radical departure or chasm between the Old Testament, that you're saved by works, and the New Testament, where you're saved by grace. And there's still Christians today that not only, I don't mean just Christians, there's Christian ministers today that essentially preach and teach that. That is not true. That just simply is not true. Now, can you go back in history and find Jews that lived in the time of the Old Testament who believed that they were going to earn favor with God through their own merit? Of course you can. And you can find them today. You can find them today in Christian churches who believe deep down that really merit or favor with God is achieved through personal merit. Now that is a dead-end belief. If you're here today and deep down you think that, you are believing something that is a total dead-end fiction. You are not being honest with yourself. You're not being honest as to how deeply flawed and broken you and I are. If you think I'm really gonna try real hard, and I'm gonna build up all this merit, I'm gonna offer that to God, and God is gonna at least see my effort, if not the very achievement of my merit, and He's then possibly going to accept me. You are not being honest with how totally broken and disintegrated you are as a person. You're just not being honest with yourself. And you're not understanding who God is. You're not understanding how, look how nervous you and I get if we have to perform just for an average person. Like, come up here when I'm done and we'll let you sing a special. I don't care how well you sing, you're gonna have some nerves, right? Because even though because you've been here and not a single one of us can sing worth a hill of beans. But we're all critical. See, I don't need to know how to cook a hamburger to know when a hamburger doesn't taste good. And so we're all back out there judging, criticizing. So it makes us very nervous. That's just us. That we have no business at all criticizing anybody about anything. You and I have no business criticizing anybody. And you know that, and yet you're still nervous if you have to perform for somebody, whether it be singing or maybe doing your job. Who likes to be working and then their boss comes and just stands over them, watches them? It's like you start getting nervous, you forget what you're doing. Super hard, right? You think God is less demanding? You think if you actually could really understand that He's standing there right next to you, watching everything you're going to do this merit, He's watching it, and He's like, oh yeah, that looks great. Anyone in the Scriptures who ever came in contact with God fell down like they were dead. They didn't even have the strength to stay standing. So the idea that you're going to accumulate merit and therefore win God's favor, that's just a complete dead-end belief. And that's why Old Testament Jews did not believe that. They didn't. They did not look at the law as a means of earning salvation. They never did. There's a very influential book that was written in the late 70s by a Texan theologian. His name is E.P. Sanders. And it's called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And in it, he makes a very extensive and academic historical argument that Jews never believed that as a whole. That you can find some that did, that's not the point. The point is that Judaism as a religion, Judaism as a belief system, they never believed that they were earning God's favor through the law. And when we read the Old Testament, it's clearly obvious. Do you know what part of the Bible the apostles and Jesus quoted when they preached grace? Anybody know? The Old Testament. Because they didn't have a New Testament. The first 100 years of Christianity, as Christians went out preaching, salvation is by grace through faith, not of works. Do you know what they were saying? They said, that is according to the Scriptures. Which Scriptures? Well, the Scriptures like Psalm 51, where David says, you do not want any sacrifice that I could give. You understand what David is saying? David's saying, you don't want sacrifice. When did he write that? He wrote that, for those that don't know, Psalm 51 was the psalm that David wrote right after Nathan had reproved him for murder and adultery and high treason. So here you have this devout Jew who has committed terrible crimes against the law of God, broken the most serious of the 10 Commandments. What would a Jew in that situation think he should do? Well, if we take the fiction that is believed too often, well, then we would think, well, a Jew in that situation would think, I need to go and I need to kill a lamb and I need to make a sacrifice and I need to then go back to keeping the law. And there's not a word breathed of that out of David's lips. You know what David says? Your mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. You would not have any sacrifice that I could give. What is the sacrifice, David says, of the sinner that God will accept? The humble and contrite heart. That's what God doesn't reject. Isaiah speaks for God saying, your feasts and all your holidays and all your sacrifices are disgusting to me. I can't bear them. So no, they did not believe that they were going to be saved by works. Here's the problem that we have as we look at Old and New Testaments. And that is, both Old and New Testaments make two arguments from opposite ends. And we see this even in the New Testament. So, for instance, Martin Luther, he really had a low esteem of the Epistle of James. He called it the Epistle of Straw at one point. He kind of backed that off. He backed away from that later in his life, but when he was young and very zealous of his insight into salvation by grace alone, by faith alone, he went overboard. He stepped over the line a little in his preface. When he wrote a preface to the book of James, he called it the Epistle of Straw. For those that don't know why, it's because James is the book that says faith without works is dead. Well, that just seemed to fly in the face of what he had read in Paul, where Paul says we're saved by faith and by grace and not of works. And here's James apparently saying the exact opposite. But what we actually have in James and Paul are the exact same argument being made from both ends, they're burning both ends of the candle, so to say. Paul says, and we find this in 1 Corinthians 13, we find it in Romans 9, for instance, and the end of Romans 9. But Paul says, works without faith are dead. Works, if they don't have faith, they're no good. That's what Paul says. James says, faith that doesn't have works is dead. They're essentially saying the same thing. They're just approaching it from opposite angles. So Paul says, if I have faith that I can remove mountains, but I don't have works, well then that's nothing. I mean, if I have works, but I don't have love, I don't have faith, then that work that I can move mountains, the work of moving mountains becomes nothing. If I give my body to be burned, but I don't have that love, that charity, it's nothing. Paul says the Jews followed after the law in Romans 9. He says the Jews followed after the law. They tried to keep the law, but it didn't do them any good. Why not? Why did the law not profit the Jews? Because they didn't mix in faith. Romans 9, 31 through 33. They didn't mix in faith. So he's saying works without faith, no good. And James says, yes, but it's also true that faith without works is dead. Now what he means by that, and he clarifies it at the very end. If you read James chapter 2, and you scroll down to the end, or you flip over, if you're still in a paper Bible, right, you flip a page over to the end of the chapter, the last sentence of chapter 2, he really explains what he's saying. He says that faith without works is like a body without the spirit. Now, if we were to put that in modern language today, he's saying that faith without works is like a mannequin. Meaning it has the appearance of a real person. All right, you look at these mannequins, especially in very high-end stores. They actually use models to cast them, so they're incredibly lifelike. But they're not real people. That's what he's saying any type of faith is that doesn't have works. Faith that doesn't have works is like a mannequin. It's like a lifeless body. It has the appearance to be real, but it isn't real. Neither one of them are saying that you have to do works in order to have faith, or that works validate your faith, as in you do the works and then the faith you have becomes real. What they're both saying is that real faith comes with an accoutrement of other things. It's just like any other complex organism or complex body. It all comes together. You can't have just one part. If you have true, real faith, it manifests itself through works. Now, the Jews tried to do the works without the faith. And that's why they didn't enter into the rest. You notice in Hebrews 4, the text that Lupe read, what was the sin that they're accused of? Why didn't they enter in? Why did they not receive the promise? Was it because of murder or adultery or thievery or taking the Lord's name in vain? It was none of them. He doesn't say they broke the 10 commandments and so they couldn't enter in. It was unbelief. Throughout the Old Testament, what is really the fundamental accusation that God makes to the Jewish people? It's not keeping the 10 commandments. I mean, they deal with that, but underlying all of those sins that they can enumerate, it all comes back to the same thing every time. Hardness of heart. Hardness of heart is just a different way of saying unbelief. They're hard-hearted towards God, which is again where we see the connection between faith and love. Because faith is a matter of the heart. It's the same language we use when you don't love somebody. It's hard-heartedness. So the problem with the Jewish people was they were not totally committed to God. They were performing. Why didn't the law profit the Jews? Well, the technical explanation we already looked at was because they didn't have faith. But what does that mean? Explain that like exactly. What does that mean? The law doesn't benefit you if you don't have faith. Let me try to explain it in postmodern language. So, if your view of the law is that you are to perform it, it will not benefit you. You ever notice? Let me try to give you an illustration. Have you ever watched old movies, like real old movies, and noticed the difference in acting between an old movie and a modern movie? There's a dramatic difference of acting that happened. It took place. The change really began in Sirius with Marlon Brando, and he's like one of the first ones that really had changed the way acting was done. Before that became what is called method acting. So before that, they were very conscious that they were giving a performance. It's like you're outside yourself, looking down on yourself, seeing what you're doing. And method acting was developed by some Russian playwrights who put a lot of thought into this and wrote a lot of essays on it. And basically what it came to is that the best form of acting would be to not be aware that you're doing it. And so now the whole thing that they're trying to do in acting is they're trying to not be aware that they are giving a performance so that it can be more realistic. And when you compare them, it's a much more realistic portrayal of those emotions than they used to be. Because they come up with ways they try to make that super authentic. The problem is that it's still a performance. Right? You can be less aware, practically any therapist is going to tell you the same thing. That if you want to better your relationships, whether they're business relationships, you're on the phone talking to people, sales, or personal one-to-one relationships, or you want to better your marriage relationship, you have to stop performing and you have to start being present. Because ultimately, the newer actors are still performing because there is a monumental difference between, for instance, Mark Wahlberg playing the soldiers on, what is it? I keep wanting to say Last Man Standing, but that's an entirely different genre. Lone Survivor, thank you. There's a huge monumental difference between him using method acting to give a very genuine, authentic performance in lone survivor, and the actual soldiers who were there, and they were not performing at all. They were just living it. Okay, so what is happening, for instance, with Israel? What's happening in Israel is they are very aware that they are performing. They're very aware of it. It's like deep into them that what they're doing is they're looking, they're saying, are we keeping the law? Am I pleasing God? I want to please God. Do you know how exhausting that is? You do. You do know. Even if it isn't in the context of God, you know. Nothing is more tiring than trying to go to sleep. You lay there and you toss and you turn and you count sheep. And no matter what you do, you can't sleep because you're trying so hard to sleep. Trying to sleep is not restful. Trying to do anything doesn't ever accomplish it. It's only when you can get out of the performance of it and just be doing it that it becomes useful. This is essentially what Paul is saying in Romans 9, and it's saying in the Old Testament. It's what it's saying in Deuteronomy when Moses says that that in the future God is going to give them a word of faith that they won't have to go across the ocean to find it. It'll just come out of them, and it'll be rest. Why is it that faith is so difficult? Why is it so exhausting? Well, it's because we're trying to perform it. It's not natural. We're not doing it naturally. We're thinking about it. And we're looking at ourselves, removed, like from above, at ourselves, asking ourselves, am I living in faith? And it's just exhausting. Why is it so exhausting for Christians when they think about being good? Because it isn't natural. It's just exhausting. It's what the Israelites found when they went into the promised land. It was supposed to be rest. And it was just worse, much harder work. We always wonder, right? The Jews are wandering around. They finally got free from being slaves. They'd been making bricks because they'd been told to. And then as soon as they get out, they're like, we should go back and make bricks. That was easier. And they were right. It was easier. I always find it humorous when people tell me, I'm going to start my own business so I can have more time for rest. Oh, you silly, silly person. That is not how it works at all. Why would anyone want to do it? Well, if you're an entrepreneur and it's just in you, it'll be the greatest thing you've ever done. If you're not, it'll be the worst thing you've ever done. Because it just will not come out. You will have to force yourself every day to work 16-hour days. Exhausting. Faith is real when it's not a performance. This is why when we think of faith and works, we think, well, I have faith, so now I need to go out and figure out some works, and I'm going to do them so I can show, so I can perform and show that my faith is real. That won't be real faith, and those won't be real works. The only thing real is you'll be real exhausted. So how do we get real faith? Real faith, as I said before, is a total commitment and trust in a person. That's why it's like love, real love. I don't know if you've ever been in a position, a situation, where you know in your head you can trust this. I used to do a lot of work up in boom lifts, super tall. I don't really like heights. And I get in these boom lifts and they go up like 40, 50 feet in the air and they're waving around, you know, and then you got someone else in there and they're walking and it's waving. And you know, look, I know in my head that boom lift is never going to break or fall. I know that. I've read all the specs. I know all about them. and yet my knuckles are white and I'm gripping the rails. But after you're in it for a while, with me it's like a month, but you're in it for a little while, you just come to a confidence that you can't explain in your head. You just trust the lift, and you don't notice it waving and swaying and lurching up and down. You don't even notice it. We struggle with faith because we don't know Christ. It's not because you don't have enough arguments. It's not because you don't have enough proof or evidence. Faith is exhausting because you're performing it instead of just living it. And the harder you try to not perform it, the harder your performance is becoming. How do you develop real faith that isn't exhausting, that is entering into God's rest? You have to become more familiar with Christ. You need to pray with that intention. Deliberately pray with the intention of becoming more familiar with Jesus Christ. Look, there's nothing wrong with asking for things. Petitions. It says, make your petitions known. Wonderful. Try this week. Every morning, get up, read something from the Psalms that speaks of the nature of God, and just express to Christ that you just want to be filled with that thinking. Just give me your mind. Help me comprehend who you are. I'm not looking for anything I'm not asking for anything. I want to have fellowship with you. I want that to pervade my thoughts today. I want to know a little more about you. When me and Terry first got married, for me it was great, for her it was exhausting. Everyone knows that to be true too. You laugh, but you know it's true. Greatest thing that ever happened to me, I don't know what she got out of it. But no, our marriage was, we had, not terrible, but we had our, we just trying to figure it out. And a lot of it was just lack of trust. So she would say something, and I would react. Why'd you say that? But it's because I figured, I just didn't have a trust that I could just take her at her word, or she could take me at my word. But after living together for 30 years, I trust her more than I trust anyone else in the world. She has all my passwords. She has access to all my accounts. I often say, and she hates it when I say it, that's why I love to say it. Marriage is like two people, each holding sharp daggers, sleeping together in the same bed. That's what marriage is like. At any moment, the other could just gut you. And yet you go to bed and fall asleep because you know the knife isn't for you. Because you just trust. You know why you're exhausted in your faith? Because you don't trust Jesus. We just don't trust him enough because we don't know him enough. Israel didn't know God. Now God solved that problem. He came down as an actual visible, physical being. And the apostles marveled, and it says, we've touched him and handled him. And they were mystified. Because they said, of course we trust him. We lived with him for 3.5 years, day and night. We trust him implicitly. But you know what Peter says? And it's one of the most heartwarming passages in Scripture. Peter said, but you, talking to us, you haven't seen him, and yet you love him. You haven't touched him, but you trust him. And they're mystified. They're amazed. You are the one that Jesus was talking about when he said, blessed are those who believe who haven't seen me. They haven't put their finger in my hand. They haven't put their hand in my side. they're blessed. There is a rest for you available. That's what it says. Today, there is a rest. You do not have to be exhausted. Just stop performing. Just stop. Start knowing Jesus. Know Jesus, and you'll know rest. We're gonna close with prayer. Then the musicians are going to come up and lead us through a hymn. And I would ask you to think about what we talked about. If any of you have any questions at all about anything, I'll be here for a few minutes. I'll be happy to try to answer them. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word that reveals you to us. We thank you for your living word, Jesus Christ, who brought the greatest revelation we've ever known, where we can just enter into firsthand, close experience with you, develop deep, unflinching trust in you. We thank you for that blessing. Help us to enter into the rest that you have prepared for all those who believe in you. And I ask this in the name of Jesus, our great God and Savior.